the star of today's show, Betsy Bishop. Betsy is president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and has been working in policy and politics in the state of Vermont for over 20 years. I've enjoyed working with Betsy. I met her a couple of years ago when she was in the governor's office, and she and I put together a couple of the most successful governor's days that we've had down here. And from there, I've worked with Betsy when she assumed the position of president of the Vermont Chamber as part of our Vermont Association of Chambers of Commerce Executives, working, as we all do, on the state level and on the local level to enhance the economic vitality of our wonderful, wonderful state. Betsy and I have been talking about this day for quite some time. We're honored in Brattleboro to have Betsy and her colleague Jessica Gingras here on the first, is this not the first, of a tour that she's making of state chambers to talk about what's going on in Montpelier that would be of concern to everybody throughout the state. Betsy Bishop, the president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce.
Wow, what a great crowd, and I have been tutored quite well over the years by Jeff Lewis, who many of you know, and has told me that, you know, if I am going to kick off a road show, a tour of the state, and talk to all the chambers, I should do it in Windham County. So that's why we're here first, starting here. And generally what we do is, as Jerry mentioned, there are about 38 chambers of commerce in the state. And we work as the statewide chamber. Our geography covers the entire state. But we also have to work in tandem with our local and regional chambers so that we can help get your input too as we start to craft our legislative agenda. So for us, today sort of begins the run-up to the legislative session, which begins in January. And we have gone out to our members, we have been surveying them, we've been talking with them about sort of the key issues that they would like to discuss. Before I get into legislative affairs in detail, I'm going to give you 2 minutes about the Vermont Chamber of Commerce and what we are and what we do. You obviously know about Chambers of Commerce from your perspective with the Brattleboro Area Chamber of Commerce, but with the Vermont Chamber, we focus on 4 things. We focus on networking, advocacy, marketing, and education. And we have many members throughout the state in every sector that come through those doors in different ways. But the advocacy part of what we do focuses on every business, and we really look for those common issues of healthcare, of taxes, unemployment insurance that affect every single business regardless of what sector you're in. As we were developing our legislative agenda, something happened, not just to us, but to the entire state. And we all met Irene. And we might have had all these plans prior to Irene about ideas that we were going to bring to the legislature to help businesses grow and thrive, to create more jobs in the state. That's our mission. But I think that you will see this legislative session will be colored predominantly by looking for that funding, creating a budget, excuse me, creating a budget that is going to be able to rebuild our roads and bridges, get state employees back to work in facilities that are centralized again. There's a lot of work going on. A lot has been disrupted. Certainly, I don't need to tell you folks, looking sort of at a couple of folks I know from the Wilmington area, what has happened there. And that has happened all over the state. And I think that the budget this year is going to be particularly difficult as we look at long-term funding mechanisms for rebuilding Vermont in the way that we know that it needs to be. I'm sure you've seen articles in the newspaper about the hundreds of millions of dollars that we're talking about as projected for that. So what that does to a budget is, for everybody else's program, you might have wanted an extra million for this particular training program or an extra $1 for this or that. It makes it incredibly tough because there's so many other more urgent needs. And so one of the things that we will be looking at with the budget is, where do those revenues come from and how does that impact business? As a general course of action, the Vermont Chamber of Commerce does not support tax increases. We'd like the state to be able to live within its existing means. And that makes that difficult when you're looking at a budget of this magnitude with a major hurricane with some major needs. So far, the governor has said taxes are not where we're going first, so that's good news. We'd like to make sure that we end in June at that point and looking at some creative ways for financing. And we've seen some of those starting to emerge. So certainly as we look at taxes this year, we will look at, will there be smaller ones to support this program off to the side? Those are all things where our eyes are on that. The Vermont Chamber of Commerce has a 4-person lobbying team at the State House on a regular basis. We cover every single issue, and we'll talk about many of them today. But please note that we will talk about some issues. We will not talk about some issues today, but feel free to ask us, because even if they're not on our top priority list, if they come up, we're there covering you folks for that. It's for our members that we do this type of advocacy. Along with the budget and taxes comes the discussion about tax reform. Over the last 2 years, the legislature has been wrestling with whether we're going to do tax reform. Jess, I'm not sure why this is on my issue since you're the expert on tax reform, so I'll tip it off. If you have further questions, I'm going to ask her to come up. But regarding tax reform, we have heard the Speaker of the House say that tax reform is off the table this year. When we were talking about tax reform, we're talking about looking at how we move from a taxable income methodology to AGI, adjusted gross income, the adjusted gross income. And what that happens in that conversation, that's something that we could support, but what happens in that conversation is you talk about your mortgage interest deduction, you talk about charitable deductions, you talk about your health care deduction, and all of a sudden people get very worried about where am I going to end up on that change. So it's been 2 years that the legislature's been wrestling with it. We thought that this would be the year that they would actually come together and make that recommendation. But we're starting to see some signals that that is not going to be a major thrust. And my guess is, again, because we're looking at the overall financial picture of the state, this might not be the year for that reform. So what other issues are going to play a major role? For me and for the businesses that I represent across the state, the healthcare reforms at both the federal and the state level are immense. And if you're a business in this room and you have not delved into how these healthcare reforms are going to impact you, I strongly encourage you to do that. If you need to start somewhere, call me and I'll help. You probably have local people that you rely upon. There is a major change coming down the path, and you folks need to be prepared. What I find is that when I have these conversations with employers, it seems like it's a ways off, so folks are not delving in, and I strongly encourage you to. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it today, and hopefully people are curious enough that when we get to the Q&A, we can delve a little bit deeper if you'd like. One of the things that is very helpful to understand for healthcare is that there are 2 types of reform going on. There's the federal reform, and then there's the state reform that came after. And many people confuse what needs to be done. With the federal reform, every state has to go through the same exercise. How states are implementing the federal reform is different. Vermont jumped on it, passed it, got it done very, very quickly. I talk to my counterparts, the other 49 state chamber executives throughout the country about once a month about healthcare. No one is moving as quickly on the federal healthcare reforms as Vermont, trust me on that. Many of them are moving much more slowly. Some have even opted out of doing certain things. So what did the federal reform do versus the state reform, and what do you need to worry about? The federal reform said the goal of the federal reform was to allow greater access to health care insurance. It said states need to create an exchange of some sort to allow greater competition for an insurance market. This word exchange you will hear a lot of. How many of you have ever booked your travel on Expedia or something similar? Great. So think of this healthcare exchange like Expedia, if you will. The notion, again, I'm talking about the federal reform. The notion of the federal reform is that each state would set up an exchange. Perhaps even they could work with other states to set up an exchange. The feds gave us that flexibility and said that the exchange will allow all insurance products to be purchased on that, and that an individual or a business could dial that up, look online just like you would Expedia, and figure out where you want to go, how much you want to pay, what benefits you might have, choose your copay, and it would spit out how much that would be and what your choices are. It's very similar to what Massachusetts passed for a reform several years ago. That's the notion behind the federal reform. So all of the states are in some way, they are starting to build those exchanges. So along comes last year in Vermont. Vermont jumped right on this and said, we need to establish an exchange right away. And so our state reform and how that differs from the federal reform is what I'm going to talk about a little bit. Our state reform has said, we're going to build an exchange in the short term. But in the long term, we're going to create a universal healthcare system. So it's a two-part reform, and many, many people get these things confused. You might hear the second part referred to as a single-payer healthcare system. What Vermont did was say, we're going to do Part A first. It goes into effect in 2014, and it's going to affect small businesses mostly and individuals. Part 2 is, while we're building the exchange, we're going to go to the feds and ask for waivers from that federal law so that we can create a new system that is a universal access system where all people can be on that, and in essence get an exemption from the exchange that we're building. But since we don't have that yet, we must build the exchange. Everybody with me so far? Sort of nod, good, okay, great. So what my role at the legislature has been is to make sure that exchange is the law of the land. The feds have mandated that we establish that exchange. So my goal at the legislature is to make sure that that exchange works really well for businesses and their employees. Because I know for a fact that we are moving to the exchange. This is not a choice. This is something we will all be doing. We will be moving to that exchange. What we don't know is if we will ever get the waivers and if we will be moving to a single-payer healthcare plan. We certainly have policy leaders who are pushing for that. We have a lot of money and resources going into creating that, but it is contingent upon the feds giving us waivers from the federal law that was passed. So it's a maybe, whereas the exchange is a definite. So I put my energies at the exchange.